I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Bob Grese is well known to Alliance members. His presentation is on the landscape designs of Jens Jensen and O.C. Simonds. So Bob.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I have to note that this is a abbreviated version of a lecture I was invited to give earlier this winter at the Landmarks Indiana presentation. And if any of you were there, I know Ahmad was there, will have heard parts of this. So I apologize if you have to sit through hearing the same thing again, but I tried to tailor it a bit to this program. What I was asked to do at that lecture was to give a bit of an overview of both Jens Jensen and O.C. Simonds' work in Indiana. And I'll go through parts of this quickly to save time, but it is really an overview presentation. And if we don't have time for as many questions, I'll be around throughout the conference to be able to answer some of them. I want to mention, so Jensen and Simonds were two landscape architects in the late 1800s and early 20th century, and are somewhat known for their engagement in both conservation efforts, encouraging the use of native plants, and creating naturalistic gardens. And they weren't necessarily isolated. They were connected to a broad network of people around the country that were creating native gardens in a variety of places. And this is a list of showing some of those people, including a number of women, particularly Elsa Raymond and Edith Roberts, Genevieve Gillette, Nelchi Blanchard, Eloise Butler, and so forth, that were all encouraging a more ecological approach in some ways to garden design. Eventually, their style of work by Simonds and Jensen, and also Walter Burley Griffin, were characterized as part of what became known as the Prairie Style, because it was really the same period as the Prairie School of Architecture was being created in the Midwest. And it was considered that this style was more evocative of the Midwestern landscape, our fairly flat topography, and certainly using the plants of the region as a major theme in their landscapes. They were inspired by the prairies and the oak openings of the Midwest and the Great Lakes states, and picked up on many of their aesthetic qualities in their landscapes. So I'm going to briefly talk first about O.C. Simonds, and then I'll talk more about Jensen and talk about their work in combination. So Simonds was the older of the two, born in 1855 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He learned plants from his family's farm in West Michigan, studied civil and environmental engineering at the University of Michigan, and was one of his first jobs after graduation was to survey the dune lands in West Michigan that had been cut over to rebuild Chicago after their fire in 1871. He eventually went to work for a firm by William LeBaron Jenney, who had been teaching at the University of Michigan. And one of his earliest jobs was to do survey work of Graceland Cemetery, which had been built as the city of Chicago at some point decided to abandon the large number of cemeteries in the heart of the city and to move some of the graves out to these regional cemeteries around the edge of the city. And because the movement at that time was to create these large rural or sort of lawn-type cemeteries, that's the way they were built. What Simonds introduced at Graceland was much more of an emphasis on the regional flora and creating outdoor rooms. Although it's kind of ironic that Graceland became known for its monuments in many ways rather than its landscape. Although it was first really celebrated for its landscape, eventually it became known for all of the architects that built the monuments and the gravestones at the cemetery. Both Simonds and Jensen were very active in creating residential designs. For Simonds' career, there isn't really an archive of his work, and so it's very difficult to track a lot of work done around the Midwest. There are a few archives that have a few materials, but a lot is what has survived in people's individual records for their family and so forth. These are two projects that did survive. One, a glass lantern slide that was in the University of Michigan collections, and then a series of houses, which was really kind of an early condominium type development on the edge of a golf course. One of the themes that Simonds was particularly known for was thinking about the landscape as a series of outdoor room-like spaces. So you'll notice particularly on the Julia Larned house on the upper right, that there's a series of outdoor rooms created by shrubbery and trees, so you could walk through a series of outdoor spaces. And some of these you can't really read on this diagram, but there is at least one that's a pathway or view from the porch of the house out to the sunset. And this sort of intersection of the light qualities was an important theme of both Simonds and Jensen's work. Here's another landscape designed in Dixon, Illinois, where he did a good bit of work both in the park system and residential work. This property borders on the Rock River, and it was described in an early article as a very low maintenance landscape because there was no lawn except for mowed paths. And there was an attempt to restore some small wetland pools as part of a wetland complex. And the plantings themselves were a mixture of both native plants as well as common horticultural varieties such as peonies and iris and so forth. One of the features of Simonds' designs that also was replicated in Jensen was less concerned about what the views were into the property from the outside edge. So at his own house on Montrose Avenue in Chicago, he basically created a barrier plantings around the edge to give a sense of privacy from the house. So your views from the house were into shrubbery around the borders and less concerned about what people would see from the street. He did design park systems throughout the Midwest, less so here in Indianapolis because certainly they were contemporaries of Kessler, and Kessler was doing the major parks in Indianapolis. One of the systems that he designed, and he was very much involved in parks and boulevard associations in a variety of towns, was the city of Quincy, Illinois, where there is a network of parks. And these are just some images of those particular parks. He frequently intersected with the Olmsted Brothers firms, particularly on college campuses. He was asked to do a plan for the Michigan State University campus, which at the time was Michigan Agricultural College. And one of the key features he did was to take this, it doesn't show on this drawing as red, but there was a red line he drew on the plan, and he said no building should ever be built into this zone, that the historic trees there, particularly bur oaks and white oaks, would be more remembered by alumni than any building in that landscape. And so it really shaped the core of campus to show that the landscape was incredibly important going forward. And I was just talking to an alum who's now doing graduate work at Michigan State, and he found that he was automatically attracted to that part of campus where there were the oldest trees and the open qualities. Simonds also did park work, the early parks for the city of Ann Arbor. And this is another case where the park district had lost many of the records of the parks. And when I came to the University of Michigan some years ago, I was able to document that Simonds, they just assumed that the Olmsted Brothers had designed all the parks. But it turned out that Simonds had designed all of the core parks. The Olmsted Brothers were working on neighborhoods and some other things there at the time. But they were unfortunately, the parks were misattributed to that firm. And this small map here shows the network of parks designed by Simonds. Including in his designs was the Nichols Arboretum that I had the privilege of serving as the director for a number of years. Here's a view of that park. It's a very steep property that falls about 200 feet from the road at the bottom of the map down to the Huron River. As I mentioned earlier, the list of projects by Simonds has been difficult to assemble. Over the years, I've kept a record. Barbara Geiger, who wrote a biography of Simonds a few years ago, assembled a list. The two of us combined our list, and this is a list, kind of a working list that I've worked on. Here in Indianapolis, Washington Cemetery, a couple of residences, Thomas Cackley and Bennett Lyman, are ones that we've identified through various archives as being attributed to Simonds. Then moving to Jensen. Jensen was an immigrant to the United States, moving here in 1884. He became a street sweeper for the Chicago parks in 1886. And by 1888, he was moving up his career in the Chicago parks and was allowed to create what he described as the American Garden in Union Park. This is an earliest drawing that is attributed to, well, it's definitely signed by Jensen. What he did is on the extreme left-hand side of the park here, where he brought plants from the countryside into the city and used it. He felt that many of the people who are moving from rural parts of Illinois into the city would enjoy seeing these common native plants in the landscape and welcome them from home. And it created enough of a stir that he was then made superintendent of Union Park and continued to rise up the ranks. On the right of this slide shows what was more common in the parks of this time, creating artificial waterfalls, fountains, and statuary. And he created a much more simple, naturalistic aesthetic in terms of his park. Jensen was very much influenced by others in the area, particularly Henry Cole, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, one of the earliest proponents of the ideas of ecology. With his family, Jensen did a lot of surveying of the lands around Chicago and was appointed to the Special Park Commission in 1899, which was commissioned with looking at developing an overall regional system of parks and preserves around Chicago. Should mention that Simonds was also on that committee, and so the two of them intersected through the Special Parks Commission as well. He was fired from the Chicago Parks in 1900 for refusal to accept a short load of coal in the parks, but then was rehired in 1905 together with a bond issue to really remake the West Parks at that particular time. And here are some images of Humboldt Park, which was one of his favorite places. One of the key features was what he called a prairie river, where he was using, for the first time really, I think in many of the parks, native prairie vegetation around the border of this, and it became a place for sculpture demonstrations and other sorts of features in the park. One of the outgrowths of the Special Parks Commission was the idea of creating small neighborhood parks throughout the city. Initially, they were very much dominated by gymnastic equipment and ball fields, and eventually, as shown in the two plans here, Jensen created much more naturalistic plans for those, and almost like wilder habitats as a place for children to play, as opposed to the kind of gymnastic equipment and swings and playgrounds that were being built in many parks at that time. One of his key parks was remaking Columbus Park, which had existed as a golf course on the west border of Chicago. And there again, he created a prairie river, much like at Humboldt Park, and kind of a naturalistic, he disguised the source of water for the lagoons into a series of naturalistic pools and waterfalls using limestone as part of that. And then one of the features that was particularly common in Jensen's designs was what he called a player's green, which was an outdoor theater space. He had the idea that while growing up in Denmark, he had gone to the Danish folk schools, which included a lot of teaching out of doors. He felt that in our American culture, we really didn't have that kind of cultural experience of outdoor performances and celebrations in nature. So this was his answer to that, to create a place where an audience would sit, come at dusk, sort of watch the sunset over the trees, and then if the moon was out on a clear night, it would illuminate a play in the performance there. And on the upper left is the performance of A Midsummer's Night's Dream in Columbus Park. One of the key projects done in the state of Indiana was the ideal mile for the Lincoln Highway, which was a brainchild of some of the auto manufacturers here in Indianapolis and other cities in Indiana. The idea of creating a paved, what they called initially was called the Coast to Coast Rock Highway, as a paved road that would extend across the country. It was later renamed the Lincoln Highway, and Edsel Ford paid for this ideal mile to be constructed in Maryville, Indiana, which included campgrounds and rustic paths along the road, was really a vision of what our interstate system might look like. And unfortunately, most of this area of the highway is now a commercial strip of shopping malls. But it was a vision, and it did influence many highways across the country. As far as Jensen goes, we have a much more extensive record of archives, both at the University of Michigan, Morton Arboretum, and a few other places. So the list of projects is much more extensive for Jensen. And I was able to sort of tease out a list of projects in Indiana here for my lecture. Now, in terms of private design work for Jensen, he was working with an extremely wealthy set of clients, by and large. Many of his designs were almost like small working farms, and he attempted to create places that would provide respite for many of these clients that had very tense and busy jobs. And I'll just go through these rather quickly. The Harry Rubens estate was a very early one on the shores of Lake Michigan in Glencoe, Illinois. One that we'll see this afternoon is the James Allison estate, known as Riverdale, which is now the home of Marian University. Here's one of the drawings and part of the rose garden that has been restoration. So I won't say much more about it because we'll see much more of it out on the site. It overlooks what is known as the Eco Lab, which is a series of wetlands that are used now by Marian University as part of their teaching part of campus. The Henry and Clara Ford estate, Fairlane. The Fords were one of Jensen's wealthiest clients. They were the wealthiest family in America during the time that he was designing for them. This shows a few images from that landscape. Over the years, over the last 2 decades, I'd been working on updating the National Landmark nomination for the Fairlane estate, and actually this coming Thursday, a week from today, I'll be testifying or presenting to the National Landmarks Commission to hopefully vote on and update this nomination. This was nominated initially back in 1964, primarily with record of the architects, but very little mention of the landscape. And this was part of an effort on many landscapes to record the landscape architecture components of the National Landmarks process. This is an extensive estate. Originally, it was 26,000 acres that the Ford family owned. The estate itself was 2,800 acres. And it's much more reduced to what is actually the estate today, but it still retains a number of key features. One of the key features here that was similar to what was in Simonds' work was paying attention to sunrises and sunsets. And so Jensen created this great meadow that was set in axis with the summer solstice, the setting sun. And the whole place takes on a magical light at that particular time of day. One of the key features is the stonework that was used to disguise Henry Ford's hydroelectric dam in the Rouge River. And this is showcased as some of that stonework which has mostly survived remarkably well. There's been some erosion problems with sections of it, but it retains in pretty good shape. Another of his major designs here around the Indianapolis area is the Stallnecker estate, known as Questover. Frequently in many of these designs, Jensen took a road rather than directly entering to the main house. He would move the landscape, the road through the landscape. You'd get a glimpse of the house and then go around a large meadow type space, and then you'd finally arrive at the mansion. Here's another image of that, and again, stonework and a series of pools associated with that landscape. Another key landscape here in the Indianapolis area is by Goethe Link that was owned until recently by Rob and Jennifer Sloan. And I was able to work with them a bit in terms of recovering some of the stonework around the pools. And they had a number of local people involved in helping replant this landscape in the early teens. The F.D. Frawley estate is adjacent to the Newfields property where we'll be this afternoon. This was owned by the Indiana Museum of Art, but it was recently sold off, as I understand it. I've always enjoyed looking at the plans here, as this is kind of an ideal miniature version of Jensen's large estates with these meadow spaces on either side of the house. And then one of the other projects in northern Indiana up in Hammond is the Morrisdale Plain, which is part of the subdivision that was created with Knickerbocker Boulevard that Jensen designed, moving through this housing development. Then in addition to his work for Fairlane, for Henry and Clara Ford, he had another major project for the Fords, Edsel and Eleanor Ford's house in Grosse Pointe Shores. For Edsel and Eleanor, he had designed 4 different estate properties, including their private retreat in Highland, Michigan. And at the Ford house, again, he used this idea of a meadow space lining up with the summer solstice. In recent years, I had the ability to work with renovating the swimming pool and a series of lagoons, and we had great fun in working through these historic photographs, trying to play out exactly what was actually implemented versus what was shown on the plans. And there was a lot of detective work in terms of looking at what actually got planted there, but I think what we ended up with is very close to what was there originally. Moving in downstate Illinois, Lincoln Memorial Garden was one of Jensen's last major public projects. It's meant to be a living memorial to Abraham Lincoln. Many of the plants that he wanted were not available from the commercial nursery trade. And so school children across the Midwestern states where Abraham Lincoln had lived collected acorns that were planted as trees. So it was quite a remarkable landscape to think of planting via seed as opposed to bringing mature trees, although they did bring in seed or sapling trees that the garden clubs of Illinois helped to plant. And then in 1936, these Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts marched across the site to plant acorns around the Lincoln Council Ring. These council rings were a major center for storytelling, performance as part of this landscape. Then one of Jensen's last landscapes was his private home, which he turned into a public school known as The Clearing in Ellison Bay, Wisconsin, which survives today as a wonderful place for keeping arts and crafts instruction alive. I've had the privilege of teaching up there for many years now, teaching a course in natural landscape design as part of the overall state. So just to review some of the key themes in Jensen's and Simonds' work, much of their work was based on an observation of the native landscape and its patterns as a basis for design. There was an attempt to connect these landscapes with the natural heritage of a region. They were taking clear advantage of people such as Henry Coles and others that were developing ideas about ecology, forestry, and so forth in their designs. And one of the things that makes it somewhat challenging in terms of historic preservation is that they really intended their designs to change and adapt. And so as you work with a Jensen or a Simonds landscape, it often requires thinking about what their vision was for these landscapes to change over time, rather than taking it back to some earlier version. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there was this broader connection to conservation efforts as part of their designs. So with that, acknowledge some of the sources of images, and then end with these two quotes from Simonds and Jensen, and may be able to take a question or two, but I'll certainly be willing to answer questions this afternoon. So that's a very, very brief, very quick overview of their work, and thank you.
I think we have time for 2 questions. Questions?
John.
I have a question because the first time I met you, Bob, was at the clearing when the Alliance was there, and I think it was 2000, 2001, something like that. So it was a great privilege to be there. When you started to explore the work of Jensen, and today, I think a few years later, and I understand that you wrote a book about that, what have you learned, or has your thinking changed dramatically since that first foray into USC?
Sure. So just to tell you how I got started, I was looking for a thesis topic when I was a grad student at University of Wisconsin, and my advisor suggested that Lincoln Memorial Garden would be a good place to look at, that they were, at that point it was about 50 years old and badly in need of a management plan to think about how to manage that landscape. And so I took that on. I was able to get a couple of grants from the National Endowment for the Arts that allowed me to expand my studies of that, and it sort of grew into a broader examination of Jensen's work. And I would say that what have I learned? Certainly there's a sense of humility, I think, in terms of thinking about landscapes over time, and so that was a key theme. One of the things that I didn't really know much about it early was this whole interplay of light and landscape, and thinking, I think both Simonds and Jensen, maybe, I know Jensen in particular was a photographer. I don't know about Simonds, whether he was quite as much, but thinking about how light changes over the seasons, how light changes over the course of a day, and how that interplay between light and landscape is something that really struck me in terms of their designs. And then the linkages to broader conservation efforts, I think, was also something that I learned and that I've come to appreciate, particularly over my years of serving as director of Nichols Arboretum, which was a design by Simonds. And one of the current efforts that I've been involved with is that the University of Michigan, in the wisdom of its master planning, has decided recently to create a overhead tram system that would go over much of a major section of the Arboretum. And so I wrote letters to the president and the regents about that, and we've created quite a stir. We've got almost 10,000 signatures that I think is forcing the university to backtrack on that whole idea that the Arboretum is much too of a sacred place for them to simply put an overhead transportation system over the tops of the trees. The landscape architects working on that had actually drawn drawings showing this tram just going over all the trees. That I got and my complaints forced the university to take those images down, because I told them that the trees would have to be cut if they were to build this tram. And so anyway, that's just constantly trying to have to guard these landscapes.
With that, we have a round of applause.
Thank you.